Welcome back to Grade 8 History, Unit Number 1, Creating Canada, 1850 to 1890. This is Lesson Number 7. How did Confederation affect the Métis in the Northwest? Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. What problems might the Canadian government face after taking Rupert's land? How do you think the First Nations and the Métis felt about Canada taking control of their lands? I want you to put the video on pause now so that you can write down your responses to these two questions. All right, and let's get started. After Confederation, the Métis found that the land they lived on had been sold to the Canadian government without their permission. Rupert's land, which was located in the northwest region, included a large portion of present-day southern Alberta, most of Saskatchewan, all of Manitoba, northern Ontario, the northwest half of Quebec, and Nunavut. This land had been owned by the HBC, but in 1868 the land was sold to the British government, which then turned the land over to Canada. The sale, however, did not include any consultation with the First Nations or Métis who lived there. Looking at this painting on the left, the Red River community was located near Fort Garry. Why do you think the First Nations and Métis chose to live so close to a fort? Please put the video on pause now so that you can write down your response to that question. As part of the sale, the new Canadian government promised to uphold British laws and recognize all Aboriginal land titles. However, the government did not recognize the Métis as having the same land rights as the First Nations. The Canadian government's position was that any agreements with the First Nations did not apply to Métis people. Many Métis feared that they would lose their land when Rupert's land was turned over to the Canadian government. And here we see a picture of George Simpson, the governor of the HBC. He saw the Métis as illegal squatters who had no rights to claim they owned the land they lived on. The conflict between the Métis and the Canadian government around the sale of Rupert's land has come to be known as the Red River Resistance. Before the sale was finalized in December of 1869, the government sent surveyors to map out the land, which would be divided into smaller plots and given as private property to new settlers. The surveyors entered the Métis' lands without asking permission. The Métis gained a strong leader in a young man named Louis Riel. Riel was a Métis lawyer who was born and raised in Red River and had studied law in Montreal. He was intelligent, bilingual, and over time he would show that he cared about people of all backgrounds, Métis, First Nations, French, and English. Riel was successful in gathering a group of fellow Métis to drive the surveyors from the land that his people lived on. And here is a photograph of a young Louis Riel. And as you'll see as we move forward in this unit and we see more pictures of Riel, his look would change greatly over the years. The Métis then formed the Métis National Committee in October of 1869. Riel was appointed the secretary. 1 month earlier, the Canadian government had chosen William McDougall of Ontario to be the first lieutenant governor of the Northwest. McDougall never made it to Red River, however. In November of 1869, the Métis occupied Fort Garry and physically prevented McDougall from entering the community. This action prevented the Canadian government from taking legal authority of the Northwest. And here you see a photograph of William McDougall. My question for you is, Why do you think many Métis were angered that the Canadian government had chosen someone from outside of Red River to be the lieutenant governor? Please put the video on pause so that you can write down your response to this question. Right, and let's continue. The Métis established their own provisional government, or temporary government, to keep law and order in the Northwest and to negotiate a peaceful resolution with the government. Riel was named the president, and he took steps to prevent McDougall from turning the Northwest into an all-English and Protestant territory. The provisional government wrote a Bill of Rights which called for Red River to become a province of Canada. The bill also called for equal rights for all English, French, and Métis people in the areas of law, government, and education. And here's a picture of the provisional government with Riel front and center. My question for you is, what does this picture reveal about Riel's significance? Please put the video on pause so that you can write down your response to this question. Let's continue. A group of Red River settlers, calling themselves the Canadian Party, attempted to overthrow the provisional government. They were concerned with the rights and well-being of their fellow English Protestant settlers. The Métis captured about 50 members of the Canadian Party and imprisoned them in Fort Garry. Thomas Scott, a proud Orangeman, refused to stay quiet. From his cell, he insulted the Métis guards and made constant threats to escape. The provisional government held a trial in which Scott was found guilty of contempt or disobedience. Riel, who was normally a patient man who sought peace, called for Scott to be executed in March of 1870. Riel's reasoning was that executing Scott was necessary to make Canada respect his people. Here's a photograph of Thomas Scott, as well as one of a number of illustrations from the time showing Scott's execution. My question for you is, how do you think people in Ontario and Quebec felt when they saw this illustration? Please put the video on pause now and write down your response to this question. And moving forward. After months of conflict, negotiations began between Canada and the provisional government. The Canadian government passed the Manitoba Act, which made Manitoba a province with its own government. The rest of the Northwestern Territory and Rupert's land was renamed the Northwest Territories. The NWT would continue to be controlled by the Canadian government. And because of its relatively small size and its rectangular shape, Manitoba would come to be nicknamed the postage stamp province. The Manitoba Act accepted most of the terms of the Métis Bill of Rights. Métis religious and language rights were now guaranteed. Over 5,000 square kilometers of land in Manitoba was set aside for the Métis. However, the Métis would still have to apply for title to their own properties and register their legal ownership of the land. And sadly, even after the passage of the Manitoba Act, the Métis continued to be referred to as quote-unquote half-breeds. The word Métis is a French word which literally means half-breed, and the term was used in a very derogatory manner at first. The Métis would later take that name and turn it into a name which they took pride in. But it was sad that they were still referred to as half-breeds, not just by Canadians or people of European background, but also by First Nations peoples as well. Despite the passing of the Manitoba Act, there was still great conflict in Canada. Many people in Ontario were outraged that the Métis had executed Scott, and they wanted Riel punished. Macdonald sent armed forces to Red River, claiming this was to protect the area from a possible American invasion. This military force was called the Red River Expedition, and sending troops was not part of the agreement with Riel's government. By the time the expedition arrived, Fort Garry was deserted. Riel had heard that the troops planned to kill him upon their arrival, so he fled in exile to the U.S. It was Lieutenant Colonel Gernet Wolseley who led the Canadian military force on a very challenging journey from Ontario to Red River. Within months of the Manitoba Act's passage, settlers from eastern Canada quickly moved to the new province. They moved on to lands that were previously lived on by the Métis. In exchange for giving up their land, the Métis received scrip from the government. Scrip was a coupon which a Métis person could use to buy land elsewhere. Sadly, Métis applications for new land were often delayed, and many Métis found that the land they applied for had been given to settlers. By 1880, almost all of the Métis found themselves without land and decided to give up on Manitoba. After successfully negotiating for their rights, the Métis felt forced to start over in Saskatchewan. And here's a picture of an actual piece of scrip from the period. And my question for you is, what design techniques were used to make scripts seem appealing? Please put the video on pause so you can take a closer look at this piece of script and then write down your response to this question. Alright, and to wrap things up, let's finish today's video by considering the following. First, what were the consequences of the Manitoba Act? And two, which of these consequences do you think were unintended? That means not meant to happen. If you don't feel ready to answer one or both of these questions, it means you need to go back and watch this video at least one more time. Then when you feel confident, put the video on pause so that you can write down your responses to these two questions. And as always, I look forward to an exciting discussion based around these and the questions which were posted throughout this video in tomorrow's class. But until we meet again, this concludes today's video.